Hello, welcome back to another video where I fix a movie I think could have used some improvement. Today, I'll be looking at the 2003 movie X-2, X-Men United, a sequel to the 2000 movie X-Men. And much like I did on the Superman films of the 1980s and the DC Extended Universe movies, whenever I'm fixing a sequel, it will take into account changes I made in the fix for the previous movie or movies. So take into account everything I changed in X-Men as we move into X-2. If you'll recall in my video for the first X-Men movie, I didn't think that movie or this one needed that many changes. I was going to jump into X-Men 3 and briefly cover what I would change from the first two movies, but then I started coming up with more stuff I would change, to the point where I realized the first movie needed its own video, and since I changed enough in that video that a sequel to that movie would have to reflect those changes, that means this one also needs its own video. But just because I'm doing a what if I rewrote X2 video does not mean that I dislike the X2 that we got. I like that movie quite a bit, but it's not perfect. So let's talk about what I would do to make it a little more perfect. I want to quickly talk timeline again, just like I did in my video on the first movie. I never put much weight into the idea that these movies are set sometime in the very near future. I prefer setting them within real-world history or the present day. And since I set my fix for the first X-Men movie in the year 2000, when it came out, this movie will also be set in the year 2000. Alkali Lake is only 47 hours of continuous driving from Westchester, so factor in stops for pee breaks and food. I figure Wolverine was only gone about a month in between movies, certainly not 3 years. This doesn't affect the plot of the movie, but I do want to keep the timeline in the back of my mind as I move forward with these films. The movie we got opens with one of my favorite scenes in any superhero movie ever, with a mind-controlled Nightcrawler trying to kill the President of the United States, or at least scare him, so that William Stryker can convince the President to authorize him to move forward with his attack on Xavier's school. Even though I love this scene, I'm going to be combining and changing a few characters in this movie, and in the process, I'm taking Nightcrawler out of the film. I'm sure this will be pretty unpopular. Alan Cumming did a fantastic job with what he was given. The makeup is so good, I actually believe they went and found a blue-skinned guy with a prehensile tail. The character we got is about 50% the Nightcrawler of the comics. The guy in the comics is much more jovial than this one, but I can understand why he's so somber. He was mind-controlled into attempting to kill the president, so I'd be bummed out too. So if I like Nightcrawler in this movie so much, why am I removing him? Well, what else does he do in this movie? Not a whole lot after the opening scene. He does save Rogue when the plane is about to crash, and he does help get Storm into the makeshift Cerebro during the climax, but other than that, his part is basically done after his first scene. And since Alan Cumming hated the excruciating makeup process for his character, and the studio wasn't about to bring him back for more of that for a reduced role in the sequel, it is even more evident how little of a part Nightcrawler plays here, since he never got to do anything else later on, which I assume they were planning to do when introducing him here. So what would I do instead? I would keep the assassination attempt scene, but I would replace Nightcrawler with Archangel. Originally, Archangel was going to be another one of Stryker's experiments, and you can even see some x-rays of his wings on the wall at the Adamantium lab in Alkali Lake in the last chunk of the movie. And I like the idea of Stryker doing Archangel's metal wings, much like he did Wolverine's metal skeleton. But apparently he was cut because there were too many characters. So since Nightcrawler doesn't do that much after the first scene, I have Archangel attempt to assassinate the president, then he escapes, and you can have a group of X-Men pursue him just like they did in the movie that we got. And if you're asking what Archangel will bring to my fix of the movie that Nightcrawler does not bring in the existing movie, I'll get to that in a minute. The next scene we get is a trip to the museum. Fun! But that's completely gone. All this scene does is give us some quick expository dialogue between Jean and Scott about how her powers are on the fritz, and it introduces us to Pyro, who's a bit of a bad boy, and then the rest of the characters find out about the assassination attempt on the president. But you can just as easily do all of that at the mansion, so I would do all of this with a faux danger room sequence. The movie we got was going to have a danger room scene, but there were budget cuts, so this scene was one of the first to go. So if the actual danger room is too expensive, then have an outdoor scene where the adults are monitoring the students and the use of their powers. While doing everything the museum scene does, this would show us something these movies were all too quick to forget. This is a school where these kids train to use their abilities. Some of them might want to be X-Men and go out in the field when they graduate. Some of them may want to learn to control their powers and go become accountants or something. Either way, this can give us a sense of that right off the bat. Here, I would introduce one small subplot concerning Pyro. He's got the potential to be very powerful, but his powers don't really kick into high gear unless he gets really upset. So in this training scene, he would actually perform pretty poorly compared to some of the other students. Then later, when the cops are trying to arrest him unjustly, Pyro gets mad, and then he gets lit. Yeah! But seriously, his powers are a thing to behold when he's mad, but he has to work a little harder when he's in control of his emotions. While the adults are monitoring the students, Cyclops and Jean will have their sidebar where they discuss Jean's headaches and power surges, much like they did in the museum scene. And it needs to be clearer why Jean is having these headaches and surges in the first place. I cannot tell you how many times I've watched these movies, and it was only in the last year or so that I heard someone say it was because Jean used Cerebro in the first movie that her powers are funky here. I wish I could remember who said that so that I could credit them, but that never did click with me in previous viewings of these movies. Yes, Cyclops does say that this has been happening since Liberty Island, but it needs to be clearer why this is happening. After Charles was incapacitated in the first movie, Jean felt forced to use Cerebro, which is a very dangerous tool that only Charles is practiced in using, and so we're seeing the effects of that here. Now's a good time to touch on a subplot I introduced in my fix for the first movie, Professor Xavier getting depowered by Mystique using a weapon designed by Forge. All this happened in the comics, except it was Storm who was the victim of the weapon instead of the Professor. Following that, Forge is an emotional wreck. He feels awful, he's been working night and day trying to find a way to reverse the effects of this invention. He's taken himself off the field team because he feels obligated to fix this. But the Professor does not hold a grudge against Forge. He knows Forge's heart was in the right place when he first came to the X-Men prior to the events of the first movie, and he knows Forge would not have been sitting around building jets if he thought for a second his designs were still in the hands of the US government. But Storm is pretty upset about this. As I mentioned in my fix for the first movie, Storm and Forge were a couple, but now Storm is having trouble forgiving him for being part of something designed to take away what makes mutants special. You could say this would foreshadow Storm's argument from the third movie, where she vehemently doesn't believe mutants should take the cure. She's pretty upset with Forge's involvement, but the Professor tries to tell her to take it easy on Forge, but she can't find it in her heart to forgive him. While everyone is getting ready to go on their respective missions, Forge tries to talk to Storm, but she gives him the cold shoulder. When the X-Men find out about the assassination attempt, Charles laments not being able to track the mutant without his telepathy, and Jean volunteers to use Cerebro again. Charles and Cyclops are both strongly against this, but Jean rightly points out that there are no other telepaths that they can turn to, and this is the only way to track the mutant who attacked the White House. Reluctantly, they all agree with her, and she tracks Archangel just as Wolverine gets back from his fruitless search at Alkali Lake. One of the biggest changes I would make to this plot, other than the stuff I've already added that carried over from the previous movie, would be swapping Jean and Cyclops in what they both end up doing over the course of the movie. In the movie, Jean goes with Storm to track down Nightcrawler, while Cyclops goes with Professor X to talk to Magneto in prison and gets kidnapped along with the Professor, and ultimately doesn't get to do anything in this movie, much like how he didn't get to do much of anything in the previous movie. But in my fix, Jean and Forge will go with Professor X to visit Magneto in prison, and Cyclops goes with Storm to look into the would-be assassin. This way, Cyclops isn't getting shafted 2 movies in a row. We can see him and Storm discussing strategy, and maybe talking about some of the students getting ready to graduate, and who should be put in some of the less dangerous field missions to test their readiness to be full-on X-Men. Storm is considering asking to be transferred to one of the other teams located at Muir Island or Australia. In my fix for the first movie, we established there are a couple of other teams that branched off from this team, and now Storm is having trouble with her relationship with Forge. She thinks maybe this is the time for her to take some space, and this way, she isn't constantly stepping on Cyclops' command decisions, which we saw a tiny bit of in the first movie. Since Wolverine will be eventually meeting up with Cyclops and Storm, like he did Jean and Storm in the movie, we'll also see more of Wolverine and Cyclops butting heads, but also acknowledging each other as being alright, kind of like they did silently on Liberty Island in the first movie. So what do we do with Banshee, who I also added to the cast in the previous movie? Let's put him in charge of the school while everyone else leaves. That way, the guy who wakes up in a white-hot rage and stabs the first student within arm's reach, he's not in charge of an entire school of kids. You know that scene where Bobby and Logan are hanging out and chatting in the kitchen? You could extend that scene a little. Start it with Banshee and Logan sharing a brew. Then Bobby comes in with some ice cream. Hey, how's it going? I couldn't sleep. So what are your intentions with Rogue? Basically the scene we got, just with Banshee hanging out with them also. And with Banshee's daughter Siren being one of the students who gets kidnapped, Banshee will move heaven and heck to get her back, along with the other students. Up until now, Banshee will have been pretty laid back and chill, like he was portrayed in the mid-1970s. But when someone messes with one of his loved ones, oh boy, watch out. When Stryker and his men attack the school, I'd keep pretty much everything the same, with one of the soldiers hitting up Banshee with lots of tranq darts, so Bobby, Rogue, Pyro, and Logan end up dragging him along with them, which explains why he didn't go after the soldiers who kidnapped his daughter, and then this subplot can progress the way that it did in the movie, with this group going to Iceman's house and talking to his parents before they reconnoiter with Cyclops and Storm. Speaking of Cyclops and Storm, in the movie we got, once Nightcrawler tries to kill the president, for some reason, is then free to go on with his life. I cannot fathom any reason why Stryker would let Nightcrawler Nightcrawler go at this point, unless Nightcrawler was somehow able to break his programming, when we see other mutants like Cyclops and Lady Deathstrike are not able to. And if that is what's happening, it wasn't explained in the movie. So instead, we have Archangel, he makes his assassination attempt, then Storm and Cyclops try to track him down, but they can't find him because he's gone back to Stryker. Since Stryker got all of his intel from Magneto, still in prison after the events of the first movie, he knows someone might try to track his mutant assassin, so he gave Archangel orders to fly around a little bit, go up to Boston, and then come back to headquarters. So while Cyclops and Storm had a location on Archangel from Jean before they left the mansion, he's not there when they arrive, so they'll eventually meet up with Logan and Banshee when they can't find the assassin. And now is as good a time as any to talk about why Lady Deathstrike will not be in my fix for this movie. The Lady Deathstrike of the comics has beef with Wolverine because the adamantium on his bones belongs to her father, and she sees it as her duty to reclaim that to restore honor to her family name. The Lady Deathstrike of the movie, I don't know. She has a single line of dialogue, and it doesn't shed much light on her character. Lady Deathstrike is kinda in the same position that Sabretooth was in the first movie. We need someone with claws to fight Wolverine, so we change her from a human cyborg with a vendetta against Wolverine to someone with his exact same powers he can fight and brutally murder. Oh, did I mention that she's actually mind-controlled by Stryker, so it's kinda horrible that Wolverine kills an innocent like that? Not to mention, Wolverine can fight any character. It doesn't have to be someone with similar powers to him. So while Archangel will be taking on Nightcrawler's role in the movie, he will also be absorbing Lady Deathstrike's role as well. He will be the mutant that Wolverine fights at Alkali Lake, but instead of Wolverine savagely murdering him, somehow he will break from his programming, and then he can be fleshed out more in the next movie, which was already introducing Angel in the movie that we got. But backtracking a little, Professor X, Jean, and Forge will go to visit Magneto in prison. In the movie we got, Cyclops suggests that Magneto might be behind the attack on the president, but Charles shoots this down and says this would only hurt the cause of mutants, and Eric would know that and wouldn't be behind such a stunt. And then he goes to the prison to ask Magneto if he knows anything about the attack. So instead, I'm saying that Charles goes to visit Magneto to see if he can maybe offer some information on the whereabouts of Mystique. While Charles is pretty sure Magneto would not do something like this, Mystique just might, because in the first movie, we've already established that while Mystique and Magneto were working together, they weren't bosom buddies or anything, and now that Magneto is in prison, maybe Mystique is making her own plans, which Charles wants to check and see if that's what's happened with the attack on the White House. And speaking of Mystique, I'm going to say that she's not in this movie. This does considerably change the trajectory of what Magneto does and when he does it in this movie, but have no fear, I've got a plan. So Charles and Eric catch up a little, and this will be where Magneto finds out for the first time that Mystique depowered Charles, and he'll be visibly upset. Even though these two went down very different paths, Eric never wanted this for Charles, and even without his telepathy, Charles knows that. In any case, Magneto sorrowfully reveals that he gave Stryker information on Charles and the X-Men, which leads to Charles and his group getting kidnapped by some soldiers working for Stryker. But because Magneto was unaware that Charles had been depowered, he unintentionally gave Stryker faulty information. Stryker is only now finding out that Charles is now powerless, so he cannot use Cerebro like Stryker wants him to. But Jean can with some persuasion from the mind control chemical Stryker has extracted from his medicated mutant son. So Jean's repeated use of Cerebro will give a little bit of an impetus for why Jean becomes Dark Phoenix later on. So another big change I would make here would be that Magneto will be apprehended along with the X-Men who are visiting him and will be taken to Alkali Lake. I figure if Stryker has enough pull to have Magneto's visitors straight up kidnapped, then he probably has enough pull to have a terrorist who is in captivity be removed to a location of his choosing. Why does Stryker do this? He hates mutants, and Magneto almost killed all of humanity at Liberty Island, so if Stryker's plan works, he wants to watch this guy die. Why am I doing this? Because of an idea Reddit user the Mighty Heptagon posted last year. Mighty Heptagon, if you're watching, I'm a big fan. This way, we will get to see more scenes of Magneto and Charles working together. One of my biggest regrets with these movies is that these two only get one or two scenes together in each movie, and we are mostly left to fill in the blanks on their lifelong friendship. But since this movie has both of them captive of Stryker at different times, all it takes is a few minor tweaks to have them be captured at the same time and work together to escape. Removing Mystique was just a happy accident, since I had already planned for her to have her own agency when I was tweaking the first movie, so her risking life and limb to release Magneto would not make much sense. She probably thinks she can carry on without Magneto, so this all works perfectly as if I had planned it that way. Cyclops and Storm rendezvous with Banshee, Wolverine, Rogue, Bobby, and Pyro. Instead of them meeting up with Magneto, who gives them information on where Stryker's base is, they will get a brief psychic message from Jean, who is tranquilized by Stryker's drug, but remember, the constant use of Cerebro is messing with her powers, so she's still able to communicate with the X-Men, who she can sense are kinda nearby. So instead of sending Mystique in to open the doors and let them in, the team can just use brute force to open the base wide open. They don't want to do too much damage because of the mutants who are trapped inside, but there's no need for finesse here. And instead of leaving Rogue, Bobby, and Pyro out in the jet to play parts cheesy, they're coming in too. We will have some line from Cyclops about how they're almost graduates, and with the fate of all mutants at stake, they need all hands on deck with this one. This is where we will get our fight between Wolverine and Archangel, and somehow Archangel breaks from Stryker's control. Maybe he's awakened by one of Jean's Psyblasts. Speaking of, in the process of Stryker trying to hook Jean up to Cerebro, her powers damage the dam, which causes the whole place to become unstable. This is where Stryker wants to leave, thinking that his plan is as good as done. With Archangel no longer under Stryker's control, Wolverine leaves him with the other X-Men who went to rescue the captive mutants. Wolverine goes after Stryker, and it's basically what we got in the movie. But since Stryker's life is at stake here, he has no reason to tell Wolverine that he was kidnapped and experimented on, and he has a very good reason to lie and say that Wolverine volunteered for the procedure that was done to him. After all, we see that Archangel and Jean are unwilling test subjects also, so this way we can play around with exactly what did or did not happen to Wolverine whenever we get to X-Men Origins Wolverine, and we won't have to feel too beholden to what Stryker says here. Oh, and another big change. Magneto does not turn on the X-Men. In the story that this movie is loosely based on, God Loves, Man Kills, Magneto remains an ally to the team until the threat is taken care of, and they even ask him to stay with them, but he refuses because he believes there's stuff out there that will need his extreme methods to be dealt with, and the X-Men won't have what it takes to do it. This was apparently more or less how the movie was going to go, but director Bryan Singer changed it to give Storm and Nightcrawler more to do, and to keep true to Magneto's air quotes ruthless character. I will give you that it's good to give all the characters in the movie something to do, but I don't think Magneto has to be the air quotes bad guy in every movie that he's in. He's more complex than that, and it also contributes to Magneto burnout. Magneto is one of my favorite X-Men characters, but even I get tired of seeing him as the heavy in every single one of these movies. In a situation like the one he and the X-Men found themselves in here, he would put aside his crusade and work with the X-Men to save all the mutants. And if Magneto's betrayal backfires, as it does in the movie, then this would make things much, much worse for mutant kind. Would Magneto really risk setting the cause back by trying an easy out like this? I don't think he would. So everyone splits up. You have Magneto and Banshee taking the children back to the X-Jet, and then some of the others stay behind to find Jean. They find her, she's stuck in the Cerebro room. Magneto isn't here, so he can't just rip the door open. Forge is here to save the day. He invents something. It doesn't count as a Deus Ex Machina when it's his powers in the comics. I figure this might be the closest Forge will come to redeeming himself, even though he will still feel like garbage for his part in Professor Xavier losing his powers, and Jean forcing herself to use Cerebro in his stead. Forge stops Cerebro from doing its thing. The X-Men grab Jean and are on their way out. And they're almost out the door, but then Jean senses that they don't have enough time. She stays behind to telekinetically keep the dam from exploding and drowning all of them. She also maybe feels responsible since it was her powers that broke the dam, and she also almost killed the entire human race as well. She and Cyclops have a tender goodbye. She probably has to knock him unconscious like she did in the comics when she first got the Phoenix power. All of the X-Men get on the X-Jet except for Jean. She seemingly dies. And I mentioned that this movie is loosely based on God Loves, Man Kills, so I would conclude the movie with Charles asking Eric if he will join them and they can help mutants together. Rogue will probably have something to say about that, but just like in God Loves, Magneto says no. There's still people out there like Stryker who want all the mutants dead, and Eric cannot come teach at the school when those people could spell the end of the mutant species. As he prepares to leave, Pyro goes with him. I'd like Pyro to be just a little less evil than he was in the movie, and have more of an ideological reason for joining Magneto. The movie didn't make him completely one-dimensional. He did have that one scene where he was jealous of Bobby having a family growing up, but that's not quite enough for him to want to subjugate all humans. I do like the conversation between Magneto and Pyro when they were on the jet, so maybe Magneto could offer some advice to Pyro on ways that he can use his powers more effectively when they're all running around in the Alkali Lake base. Then when you get to this scene, Pyro can say that seeing Stryker's men ready to kill all of them for no good reason, that's made it clear to him that the professor is wrong about humanity. That, combined with his family likely abandoning him when he was a kid, and Magneto acting as a better teacher than any of the X-Men have been, that will propel him to join Magneto. So Magneto and Pyro leave, and maybe it's this conversation that prompts Professor X to go have a chat with the president to tell him that he was manipulated and that all mutants are not the enemy. And that's what I would have done with X-Men too. Like I said at the beginning of the video, this is not a bad movie. I like it a great deal. A lot of what I added here is mostly springing from what I had already added in the previous movie. But much as I do like the existing X-2, maybe I'm biased, I do like my version a little bit better. So what do you guys think? Let me know in the comments, and be sure to throw those likes my way and subscribe to see future videos where I will fix other movies. But while you wait for those, check out what else I'm doing on my channel. In the meantime, have a great rest of the day. Catch you later.